The greatest historical error often stems from a simple bruised ego. The Otrar incident became a masterpiece of suicidal idiocy when one narcissistic ruler wiped his prosperous empire off the map with literally one wrong decision. In the early 13th century, the Khwarezm Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II felt like master of the universe, controlling a vast swathe of Central Asia. He sincerely believed he was at the pinnacle of power. Nearby, a young and deadly nomadic military machine was developing under the leadership of Genghis Khan. The funniest thing is that the Mongol leader had no intention of fighting Khwarezm at all. He needed trade, silk, gold, business, simple economic ties. In 1218, Genghis Khan dispatched a massive caravan of 450 merchants and 500 camels laden with treasure, a mission of peace. But on the border of Khwarezm sat the local governor Inalchuq, who possessed fantastic greed and a clear lack of brains. The governor declared the merchants spies in order to simply steal the gold for himself. He arrested the caravan and then cold-bloodedly slaughtered every last one. Genghis Khan was greatly surprised by such impudence. However, instead of an immediate attack, he decided to negotiate diplomatically. He sent an official 3-person embassy to the Khwarezm Shah. The demand was simple: hand over the thief and return the stolen goods. A simple legal compromise. But the ruler of Khwarezm committed a fatal folly. He decided to show his character in front of the nomads. Shah Muhammad ordered the execution of the head of the Mongol mission, shaved the beards of the surviving ambassadors, and threw them out. In steppe culture, the murder of an ambassador was considered absolutely taboo. It was a direct challenge and an immediate declaration of all-out war of annihilation. The Mongol army responded instantly. They abandoned the war in China and poured into Khwarezm like a punishing avalanche. Cities were systematically burned to ashes. Samarkand and Bukhara were reduced to ruins and vast mass graves. The greedy governor Inalchuq was captured alive and executed by pouring molten silver into his eyes. The great Shah Muhammad himself fled in panic and ingloriously rotted from disease on a tiny island in the Caspian Sea. Millions perished, and the empire simply vanished from the face of the earth. But the nightmare was not over. The Mongols advanced further west, devastating Persia, the Middle East, and reaching Europe. They redrew the map of the world for centuries to come. And all it took was the punishment of one thieving official and an apology. During World War II, the German command firmly believed in the absolute impenetrability of the Enigma encryption machine. This ironclad confidence was shattered by the panic of one captain, who abandoned a sinking submarine without bothering to personally check whether it had sunk. This was submarine number 110. In March 1941, this submarine set out on its maiden voyage. It managed to damage 2 Allied ships, and then, shamefully, it aborted the mission due to the explosion of its own deck gun, injuring the sailors. A shaky start. But the greatest shame awaited the Germans during their second voyage in the spring of that same year. On May 9th, 1941, U-boat 110 came under heavy fire in the North Atlantic. British destroyers pinned her down and began pounding her with depth charges. The hull was creaking. The crew was suffocating. Commander Fritz Julius Lemp decided to surface. The boat broke the surface right in front of the enemy squadron. This was a British operation, codenamed Primrose. The British opened heavy fire, but quickly ceased firing when they saw German sailors jumping overboard en masse. Lemp gave the order to abandon ship. He was relying on the automatic system. He thought the open flooding valves would send the vessel to the bottom, along with all her secrets. Finding himself in the icy water, Lemp turned around and understood everything. The submarine was floating as if nothing had happened. It had no intention of sinking. The Enigma machine and the secret code books with the keys to the radiograms lay peacefully on the table in the wheelhouse. Realizing the scale of the disaster, the captain swam back in a panic, hoping to correct his foolish mistake and destroy the documents. He didn't have time. Lemp simply disappeared into the ocean waves. But the British boarding party performed flawlessly. They boarded the abandoned boat and pulled out the most valuable trophies. In their possession lay an intact encryption machine and the secret backup cipher of the German Navy. This trophy allowed cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park to read German radio messages effortlessly. The British pulled off a brilliant operation. They towed an empty submarine far out to sea and allowed it to sink, simulating the loss of a vessel with all its contents. The German command remained unaware of this for the rest of the war. They lost dozens of submarines, blaming the Allies' new technology, while the British simply read their correspondence. And all because one officer was too lazy to personally verify that a simple order was carried out. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine V managed to leak his entire spy network in Bulgaria simply because he believed the tale of a repentant barbarian. 774 A.D. Constantine V desperately wanted to conquer neighboring lands. The military campaign failed miserably, but the emperor was not disheartened. He had a powerful advantage. His spies at the Bulgarian court in the capital, Pliska, were working flawlessly. They reported every move of the Bulgarian Khan Telerig to Constantinople. When Telerig sent a 12,000-strong army to secretly seize territory in the fall, Byzantine informants acted immediately. Constantine received the denunciation, quickly mobilized a massive army of 80,000, and inflicted a crushing defeat on the Bulgarians. Telerig survived, but he had logical questions. How had the Byzantines managed to ambush his soldiers so precisely? The Khan realized the obvious. His government was leaking like a leaky old bucket. A whole host of traitors lurked in his entourage. But who exactly? A normal dictator would have launched paranoid torture and executions of everyone. But Telerig played a more subtle game. He devised a disinformation scheme that became part of the textbooks. The Khan wrote a personal letter to Constantine. The text was a masterpiece of acting. Telerig feigned fatigue, fear, and failure. He wrote that he feared a conspiracy by local nobles, wanted to abdicate, and dreamed of fleeing to Constantinople under the wing of the great empire. The plan seemed foolproof. But there was one detail. The Khan plaintively asked the emperor for a list of all Byzantine agents in Pliska, ostensibly so he could coordinate an escape and safely reach the border with their help. A pure concern for security. Any sane ruler would have suspected a trick. But Constantine was so overjoyed at the prospect of a quick victory without a fight that he completely shut down his brain. The emperor sent the Khan a complete list of his spies, all names, all contacts, with regards. Having received the document, Telerig, of course, didn't go anywhere. He simply closed the gates and ordered the arrest of every person on the list. Byzantine intelligence in Bulgaria was eliminated in a single day, in one fell swoop. Constantine was left blind and deaf for many years simply because he believed the touching letter. The fall of the Berlin Wall has gone down in textbooks as a triumph of popular will, though in reality it was a circus of absurdity and bureaucratic stupidity. November 9th, 1989. Günter Schabowski, the newly appointed spokesman for East Germany's ruling party, delivered a dreary press conference. Protests were raging across the country. The authorities frantically tried to salvage the regime and, in a closed meeting, drafted regulations permitting travel to West Germany. The plan was to announce the announcement only the following morning. Border guards needed time to prepare. But Schabowski wasn't actually present at the meeting and received the draft just a few minutes before the broadcast. The press conference was languid until a foreign journalist asked about the new travel regulations. Schabowski put on his glasses and began shuffling through his crib notes. He read dry, official-sounding language, stumbling over his words. The journalist interrupted him with a specific question about when these regulations would come into effect. The speaker flipped through the papers in confusion, couldn't find the publication ban date, and delivered the greatest impromptu remark of the century. He blurted out that the new regulations would take effect immediately. live broadcast to the entire country. People in front of their screens froze, their mouths open. Then the madness began. Thousands of East Berliners abandoned their dinners and ran to the wall. They wanted to check if the guy on TV was lying. At the checkpoints, they were met by border guards who knew nothing at all. The top party leadership hid in fear. The phones were ringing off the hook. The border officers found themselves alone with a huge crowd. They, too, had heard Schabowski's ravings, but no one gave them orders to shoot. By 11:30 p.m., the crowd had swelled to critical proportions. To avoid a crush, the commander of one of the posts ignored the regulations and opened the gates. The border collapsed. People cried and broke concrete with hammers. And all because one bureaucrat was too lazy to read the paper to the end. Mountains of corpses and utter collapse. In 1958, China's leadership decided they were smarter than evolution. The country was attempting the so-called Great Leap Forward from poverty to industrial paradise. But instead of smart reforms, the leaders launched a war on sparrows. Some genius in the government calculated that one bird eats 4.5 kilograms of grain per year. Officials decided if the birds were exterminated, the people would receive millions of tons of free food. Simple arithmetic for people with the intelligence of a stool. Thus began a campaign against the four pests, where, along with rats, flies, and mosquitoes, the common gray sparrow was declared the main enemy. The authorities ordered a total mobilization. Millions of citizens, including school children, took to the streets. The methods were extremely noisy. The birds were simply exhausted. People spent hours banging pots, pans, and basins. Sparrows fluttered through the air in panic. They were physically unable to land due to the endless noise. The birds flew non-stop until their tiny hearts burst from sheer exhaustion. Tons of sparrows fell to the ground, dead. People broke nests and crushed eggs. In just 1 year, they exterminated approximately 2 billion birds. They practically wiped the species off the face of the earth over a vast territory. A victory of reason. And then nature showed who was boss. Without sparrows, the caterpillar and locust populations were left unchecked. The locusts multiplied at an incredible rate. The insects devoured the entire harvest. Agriculture collapsed. The Great Chinese Famine engulfed the country. According to various estimates, between 15 and 45 million people died because of this stupidity. In 1960, officials quietly ended the war on the birds. Instead of sparrows, bedbugs were added to the enemy list. To restore the balance, the authorities had to beg the Soviet Union for 250,000 sparrows and import them by the trainload. The most monstrous catastrophes on the planet are sometimes caused not by an evil dictator with a nuclear button, but by a single enthusiastic engineer with a stack of patents and absolutely good intentions. Thomas Migley Jr. managed to commit two of the greatest technological blunders of the 20th century, which caused more damage to the Earth's atmosphere than the activity of any other living organism in the entire history of the planet. This man literally poisoned the air for entire generations and punched a hole in the planet's protective dome, all while sincerely trying to make life a little more comfortable for humanity. In 1921, Midgley worked for a major automobile corporation. He was plagued by a problem. Car engines back then made a terrible knocking noise. It broke pistons and ruined mechanisms. The engineer began searching for a solution and discovered that adding a cheap substance called tetraethyl, lead to gasoline, instantly eliminated the knocking noise. Perfect? Not exactly. Lead is a deadly poison. Humanity has known about its toxicity since the 2nd century BC. At the very first experimental factories, workers went crazy, hallucinated, and died from poisoning. The inventor himself inhaled a fair amount of this nasty stuff and went away for treatment. What did Migley do? He staged a pompous press conference, inhaling the poison fumes from a bottle for a full minute, and dousing his hands with it, assuring journalists that the substance was completely safe. The lie worked. Millions of tons of lead have flown from exhaust pipes directly into the lungs of children around the world, causing dementia and increased crime. But the genius didn't stop there. In the late 1920s, Migley decided to save people from explosive refrigerators, which at the time ran on toxic ammonia. Entire families were dying in their homes due to leaks. The chemist synthesized a new substance, difluorochloromethane, or simply Freon. Another show. Migley inhales the gas and blows it out on a candle in front of scientists. Safe, cheap, doesn't burn. Freon was stuffed into every refrigerator, every can of hairspray and deodorant. Decades passed. Scientists discovered that this vaunted Freon rises into the sky and cold-bloodedly burns away the ozone layer, which protects all life from deadly ultraviolet radiation. Migley's inventions turned the planet's atmosphere into a zone of slow destruction. Fate dealt the inventor a most cynical ending. In 1940, he was paralyzed by polio. Migley didn't give up. He constructed a complex system of pulleys, blocks, and ropes to help him get out of bed. In 1944, he became entangled in his own ropes and suffocated. He died from strangulation by his own ingenious design. Karma? Perhaps. But the planet's atmosphere is still struggling to recover from his remarkable discoveries. Late October, 1962. The height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Humanity frantically awaited the moment when the superpowers would start hurling nuclear warheads. The military's nerves were on edge. Around midnight, a guard at the American base in Duluth spotted a silhouette in the darkness. Someone was persistently climbing over the fence. According to the regulations of the time, the first step before a nuclear attack was to send in saboteurs. The soldier didn't hesitate. He fired into the darkness and pressed the alarm. This signal was simply supposed to warn neighboring bases about the infiltrator. But it was a classic idiocy. At the neighboring Wolkfield Air Force Base, a clumsy engineer simply mixed up the wires while installing the alarm. He plugged a couple of contacts in the wrong places. As a result, instead of warning of an intruder, the base's emergency sortie siren blared. The pilots were on high alert. They knew perfectly well that no training alerts could be held at this stage. If the siren blared, World War III had begun. The pilots ran like bullets to their cockpits and started their engines. Their planes were carrying unguided rockets with 1.5 kiloton nuclear warheads. The crews were about to launch them at the Soviet bombers. The fighters had already begun accelerating down the runway. At that moment, headquarters in Duluth realized there had been a mistake. But there wasn't even a control tower at the Wolkfield airfield. The pilots couldn't hear the abort order over the radio. The situation devolved into a frantic action movie. The duty officer jumped into a passenger car, floored the gas, drove onto the runway to intercept the fighters, and began flashing their lights frantically. The pilots realized they were going crazy and braked. The border trespasser who launched the nuclear armada turned out to be an ordinary black bear. The bear was simply looking for food and climbed the fence. And because of this berry-loving animal, humanity nearly wiped itself off the face of the earth. We survived only because an officer in a car outran an approaching plane in time. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI managed to lose the greatest city in the world simply because he underpaid a capable engineer. In 1452, a Hungarian foundryman named Orban came to him. The man was an artillery genius. He honestly proposed to the Byzantines that they build cannons of unprecedented power, ones that would transform the walls of Constantinople into an absolute fortress. Constantine XI listened to Orban, scratched his head, and delivered a brilliant managerial response in the style of modern corporations. There was no money, and no materials either. The state treasury was empty. The empire had become a pitiful remnant of its former glory, and the emperor considered paying a good salary to a master craftsman an unaffordable luxury. The engineer's modest salary seemed too high a price to pay. Orban was simply shown the door. Where does a specialist go when an impoverished employer turns them down? To their main competitor. Orban packed his things and went straight to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who was fanatically preparing to storm Constantinople. The young sultan, unlike the Byzantine miser, was no fool. He immediately grasped the scale of the idea. Mehmed gave the Hungarian an unlimited budget, mountains of gold, hordes of workers, and as much copper and bronze as he could carry. Orban locked himself in his workshop in Adrianople. In just 3 months, he cast a true monstrosity. It was a gigantic bombard named Basilicus. Its barrel, as thick as a human torso, fired stone cannonballs weighing nearly half a ton. It took a team of 60 oxen and the help of hundreds of soldiers to drag this hellish tube to the walls of Constantinople. In the spring of 1453, Basil spoke. The walls of Theodosius, which had withstood sieges without a hitch for nearly 1,000 years, began to crumble like cheap sand under Orban's artillery. It was a technological revolution. The cannons simply smashed the ancient defenses to pieces, allowing the Janissaries to storm the breach. Constantinople fell. The emperor died in battle, and the Byzantine Empire vanished from history forever. The most ironic part of this tragicomedy is that Orban himself didn't live to see his triumph. During the siege, one of his own overheated supercannons exploded right when fired, tearing the great designer to pieces. But his brainchild had done its job. All it took was finding a little money in the budget and hiring an engineer. They skimped on wages and received the death of an empire as a gift. In the late 1990s, Kim Jong-nam was the clear favorite to succeed the North Korean throne. The eldest son of the great leader, Kim Jong-il, a smart young man, headed the Ministry of Public Security and personally oversaw the development of information technology in the country. His father was grooming him as his successor. The entire state apparatus was ready to swear allegiance to the new leader. But the prince had one weakness. He was madly in love with Western pop culture and entertainment. In 2001, Kim Jong-nam committed the most absurd act of his life. He decided to secretly visit Disneyland in Japan. For this, the future ruler of a nuclear power could think of nothing better than to obtain a fake Dominican Republic passport under the silly name of Pan Xiong. Naturally, Japanese border guards at Narita International Airport didn't appreciate this Dominican masquerade. The heir to the throne was caught red-handed. The scandal was monumental. Photos of a fat, crying man surrounded by Japanese police instantly spread across the world's news agencies. Kim Jong-il, the father, was furious at the disgrace. He even canceled his official visit to China and locked himself in the palace. The reputation of the ascetic communist dynasty was destroyed by a single trip to Mickey Mouse. The father promptly stripped the heir of all his posts and his right to the throne. He was simply expelled from the country into permanent exile. For years, he shuttled between Macau, China, and Southeast Asian resorts, squandering government funds, giving brazen interviews to foreign journalists, and, rumor has it, even leaking information to American intelligence agencies. In his place, his father chose his younger half-brother, Kim Jong-un. The boy turned out to be far more serious than the Disneyland enthusiast. When Kim Jong-un came to power in 2010, he immediately remembered his older brother, who formerly remained a dangerous rival. The ending of this story was grim and utterly absurd. On February 13th, 2017, Kim Jong-nam was calmly walking through an airport terminal in Malaysia. Suddenly, 2 young women ran up to him and quickly smeared some liquid across his face. 20 minutes later, the former heir died in terrible agony. It was the deadly poison VX. The most bizarre thing is that the captured women sincerely thought they were filming a comedy prank show for the internet. They were simply paid to play a funny prank on a passerby. Thus, a foolish childhood dream of riding a roller coaster first deprived a man of the throne and then led to his cynical assassination in a crowd of tourists. Blind faith in yesterday's enemy always guarantees a monumental failure and mountains of corpses. The Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus committed precisely this folly when he dragged his army into the dense bush. It was the 9th year of our era. The Roman Empire was actively expanding its borders and attempting to impose its rule on the wild Germanic lands. The empire sent Varus to lead the process. He was a man of importance, but naive. He sincerely believed the locals to be foolish barbarians, and he was assisted in this by a Germanic chieftain named Arminius. This young man had lived in Rome for a long time, learned Latin, received citizenship, and even served in the Roman army. Varus saw him as his own man. He trusted him completely. But Arminius secretly hated invaders, and, behind the governor's back, methodically rallied the forest tribes for one fatal blow. The end of this friendship came at the end of summer. A Roman army of 3 legions, roughly 20,000 professional soldiers, was returning to their winter bases. A colossal force. And then Arminius came running to Varus with news. A small local uprising had allegedly broken out in the wilderness and needed to be suppressed immediately. A mere trifle. The commander didn't even think to send reconnaissance. He simply deployed the legions and led them straight into the dense Teutoburg forest. It was a trap. The terrain turned out to be a nightmare. Knee-deep mud, fallen trees, narrow paths. The Romans were spread out in an endless, thin line for kilometers. To make matters worse, a downpour began. The soldiers slipped, and the heavy supply trains got stuck in the swamp. Maintaining their famous battle formation was physically impossible. The Germans, led by Arminius, were waiting for just this. They knew every nook and cranny of the forest. They launched surprise attacks from the thicket, cutting the Roman column to pieces. The carnage lasted for several days. The forest warriors cornered the imperial professional army on narrow paths and systematically slaughtered them. The Romans perished by the thousands, not even having time to draw their swords. Realizing the enormity of his disgrace, Quinctilius Varus simply leaped on his own sword. The Germans completely annihilated 3 of the empire's finest legions. Emperor Octavian Augustus literally went mad after this catastrophe. For months, he banged his head against the palace walls, begging for the return of his legions. But the dead were beyond saving. Legion numbers 17, 18, and 19 were forever struck from the army's roster. Rome abandoned its plans to conquer lands beyond the Rhine. The border froze, and the Germanic tribes were given freedom and time to grow, gain strength, and, a few centuries later, come and finally destroy the Roman Empire itself. It would have been better not to trust the traitor's smiles. Military historians love to debate tactics, but the Third Reich's greatest tactical error on the Western Front was that the fate of all of Europe was determined by one dictator's sound morning sleep and the purchase of shoes for someone else's wife. The defense of France in 1944 vividly demonstrated this. If you structure your command and control according to the principle of "I'm the smartest one here," then, at a critical moment, your vaunted military machine will simply turn into motionless scrap metal. Before the Allied landings, the German generals engaged in a classic communal squabble. They argued until they were hoarse. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stubbornly insisted that the enemy would land in the Pas de Calais. After all, that was the shortest route across the strait. Logical? Only on paper. Erwin Rommel, who was building fences on the shore, demanded that the tanks be kept right at the water's edge. He said that if the landing force wasn't thrown back into the sea on the first day, a nightmare would begin. Adolf Hitler, perched at the top of this pyramid of absurdity, couldn't come up with anything more clever than dividing the tank divisions. He gave some to Rommel, while he hid the reserves deep in the rear and forbade them to be moved without his personal order. Utter nonsense! As a result, Not a single commander had enough forces for a proper attack. And so it was June 6th, 1944. It was early morning. The Allies were landing over 150,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy. Panic reigned at German command posts, but no one could do anything. Their hands were tied. Field Marshal Rommel had even left for Germany that day. Why? It was his wife's birthday, and he was bringing her a gift of gray suede shoes. The other officers had also left, believing the bad weather forecast. And where was Hitler? He was sleeping, a sound sleep, as usual, and no one in his entourage dared wake the Fuhrer to ask permission to send in tank reserves. Precious time was slipping through their fingers. When Hitler finally woke up and approved the order by 1600 p.m., it was already too late. Allied air forces had complete control of the skies and instantly destroyed any German columns on the roads. Tanks simply couldn't reach the Normandy beaches in time. In a single day, the Allies had firmly established themselves on the coast, and the German defenses crumbled like a house of cards. A month later, an enemy airstrike seriously wounded Rommel, completely turning German command into chaos. The vaunted German discipline and rigid centralization of power backfired. They lost the war simply because they couldn't wake up their boss in time. The greatest geopolitical miscalculations are often disguised as clever strategic moves, when in reality they stem from simple fear of one's neighbor and a fatal inability to foresee the future. In 1867, the Russian Empire committed a colossal folly by selling Alaska to the United States of America for a mere $7.2 million in gold. A paltry sum. Today, it's difficult to buy even a decent passenger plane for that kind of money. And here we have a vast peninsula covering over 1.5 million square kilometers. That worked out to about 2 cents per acre of land, the sale of the century, and all because officials got scared. After the crushing defeat in the Crimean War, the empire fell into a deep depression. The authorities looked at the map and decided they couldn't defend this overseas territory in the event of another war with Great Britain. British troops were stationed right next door in Canada, and the generals expected an imminent invasion. Instead of developing the region, they decided to simply get rid of this difficult territory. They saw selling Alaska to the Americans as a way to counterbalance British expansion. An excellent strategy. Give away their possessions for next to nothing to spite the enemy. Diplomat Edward Steckel was dispatched to broker the deal. This gentleman was so active in Washington that he literally overwhelmed American congressmen with bribes and bombarded the press with commission materials, all so they would sign the treaty. The irony is that the Americans themselves weren't thrilled with the purchase. Newspapers mocked Secretary of State William Seward, who led the negotiations. The purchase was called Seward's Folly and a useless ice chest. No one understood why gold was wasted on a frozen wasteland. The realization came much later, when tons of gold were discovered in Alaska, followed by gigantic oil reserves. America gained strategic access to the ocean and colossal resources, while the sellers were left with nothing. A moment's cowardice forever changed the balance of power on the planet. To die without leaving behind a banal succession plan is the height of selfish idiocy, capable of instantly destroying the greatest state. Alexander the Great conquered everything within his reach. His dominion stretched from Greece to India, a vast patchwork hulk. In 323 BC, this great warrior suddenly fell ill with a fever and died in Babylon. He was only 32 years old, young, strong, seemingly immortal. And then came the surprise. On his deathbed, his generals began frantically whispering the ultimate question in his ear. To whom are you leaving the empire? Legend has it that Alexander, in a hoarse voice, gave the brilliant answer, to the strongest. Excellent advice. Simply bravo. Even if he didn't say it, that's exactly what happened. Alexander the Great simply left, leaving behind a gigantic political vacuum and absolute chaos. The great king's only legitimate heirs were the unborn child of the Bactrian princess Roxana and his half-brother, Philip Aridaeus. But the brother suffered from a severe mental disorder and was physically unable to string two words together, while the infant couldn't even breathe yet. There was no one to govern the state. And then his generals entered the picture. The Diadochi. These men had fought shoulder to shoulder for years, saving each other's lives and sharing the spoils. But as soon as the great boss closed his eyes, these former friends instantly transformed into a pack of rabid dogs, scenting blood. They pounced on the inheritance with savage grins. A nightmare began that lasted nearly 50 years. The Wars of the Diadochi went down in history as an endless series of betrayals, nighttime assassinations, false alliances, and massive battles. The king's former comrades systematically destroyed each other and his entire family. The great conqueror's relatives were slaughtered. His mother, Olympias, was stoned to death. His wife, Roxana, and the unborn son, who grew up to become Alexander IV, were strangled in cold blood in prison on the orders of one of his generals. The Argead dynasty was completely erased from history. By 281 BC, nothing remained of Alexander's great dream of uniting East and West. The empire disintegrated into several large, warring fragments. These Hellenistic kingdoms continued to sluggishly gnaw at each other for years, draining the region's resources. Ultimately, this endless squabbling cleared the way for a new predator. The Roman Republic arrived prepared, quickly seizing the weakened lands one by one. And all because one brilliant commander knew how to fight beautifully, but was completely incapable of thinking about tomorrow. Discovering an entire new part of the world, thanks to a complete ignorance of basic mathematics, that's something you have to be able to do. Christopher Columbus went down in history as a great discoverer, although in reality he was a stubborn amateur who simply forgot how to count and confused his miles. In 1492, all educated people knew perfectly well that the Earth was round. Even in ancient times, scientists had calculated the length of the equator quite well. But Columbus decided the ancient Greeks were clueless. He came across the works of the Arab astronomer Alfraganus. He wrote that the length of 1 degree at the equator is 56.2 miles. Sounds impressive, but our hero made a truly stupid mistake. He forgot that the Arabic mile is almost a third longer than the short Italian mile. Columbus simply took the Arabic numeral, applied it to European measurements, and with a flick of the wrist, reduced the planet's circumference by a quarter. The ground in his head instantly shrank. What followed was pure conjecture. To prove to the Spanish monarchs that rich India was literally around the corner, Columbus used the insane maps of Marinus of Tyre. According to these sketches, Asia stretched eastward for a whopping 225 degrees. Only 135 degrees of water remained on the planet. According to Columbus's calculations, the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was a measly 3,000 miles, a mere 2,400 nautical miles. Literally a couple of weeks of pleasant sailing. The royal advisors shook their heads. They shouted that Columbus's ships would simply rot in the ocean and the sailors would die of starvation. And they were absolutely right. If America hadn't been in the way, the expedition would have turned into a mass grave. Columbus was saved by pure chance. He simply crashed into a vast continent, the existence of which he hadn't even suspected, and for the rest of his life, he believed he had sailed to Asia. The luckiest loser in history. A series of fatal military and political mistakes during the interwar period demonstrated how foolish faith in impenetrable walls and underestimation of the enemy can trigger the most devastating massacre on the planet. It all began with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which became a perfect example of how a handful of well-fed victors planted a time bomb under an entire security system. They forced Germany to pay astronomical debts, seized territory, and trampled national pride. The renowned economist John Keynes bluntly called it a Carthaginian peace and warned that within a couple of decades, everything would flare up anew. No one listened. The logical result? Poverty, rampant inflation, and the rise of radicals to power. The French, sensing imminent retribution, decided to defend themselves in an original way. They built the Maginot Line. It was a gigantic, insanely expensive wall of concrete, forts, and underground galleries stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg. The builders were proud of this toy, but they made a childish mistake. They simply left the Belgian border and the Ardennes forest undefended, deciding that tanks physically couldn't get through. In 1940, German troops didn't even attempt to storm this miracle wall. They simply bypassed it through the forest in a couple of days, leaving the entire French army looking like fools. Buoyed by easy victories, the German Führer committed his most fatal folly. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. The Nazis were planning a blitzkrieg. They seriously thought they could crush a vast country in a matter of weeks. A clear underestimation of the enemy. At first, everything went according to plan. Encirclements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, German binoculars already picking out the spires of the capital's towers. But then harsh reality intervened. Endless spaces, terrifying roads, ruined supplies, and the fierce resistance of people defending their homes. Winter turned the campaign into an icy hell. The siege of Leningrad claimed over 1 million civilian lives from starvation, but the city did not surrender. And just outside Moscow, the tired and frozen Germans were met by a powerful counterattack from fresh Siberian divisions. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had left more than 800,000 of its best soldiers killed and wounded in the fields. The plan for a quick victory had failed forever. Hitler was forced to personally intervene in the army's management, making mistake after mistake. Instead of a walk in the park, they faced a grueling war of attrition, which ended with the destruction of their empire, the division of Europe, and the beginning of a new Cold War. And all because before a fight begins, you need to adequately assess your opponent and learn your geography lessons.